good morning or afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Strategies for Enhancing LIHEAP Performance Management webinar. Just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded. Today we will be kicking off the webinar with some words from Holly Ravesloot from OCS, and then we'll be hearing from speakers from different states today. So we'll be talking with Jane Blank from Wisconsin. We'll also be talking with Christine Taylor and Greg Dahoff from Iowa, and with Tracy from New Hampshire today. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Holly to introduce the webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Melissa. This webinar is focused on LIHEAP and performance management, not performance measurement. It's the action of taking those measurements and putting them into practice to manage your programs. And what we're going to do is go through some examples of how you can use this data that you've been collecting over the past few years and now officially required to report to us, and look at how you could decide whether you want to do something different with your program or if your program is meeting the expectations that you wanted it to meet. And with that in mind, you can use this data to look at client characteristics, other key aspects of the program, compare outcomes, compare high energy burden, which is something that obviously serving high energy burden households is a statutory requirement of a program, and one of those performance management measures focuses on that, of course. And you can also look at trends over time. And I want to also make sure that folks who are on this webinar received the Dear Colleague letter that went out, I believe it was last week, notifying folks that we have preliminary data available through 2016 on the performance management site. So if you did not receive that, feel free to let me know. And I will make sure that you are on the distribution list to make sure that you get those notifications in the future. But that data is now the most current data we have on performance management. Next slide, please. Okay, and this webinar is actually going to look at some of the examples that other states have used to look at their performance management goals. And so, as Melissa indicated, we have some folks on the phone who are going to walk through their process. So back over to Melissa. Thank you.
Hi there. So actually, can you take a step back, Michelle? So we're going to, for those of you who were at the national training in Washington, D.C., we started talking about how you're going to use, I'm going to have everybody go ahead and mute, how you can use your data to evaluate your matrix. Okay, let's see if we can talk now without kickback. And so what we're going to do is we're going to first hear from Wisconsin, who is successfully using this data and has been for quite a while to determine their benefits, and as a result, we'll take a look at their snapshot and see what it looks like for their program. But we're also, if any of you know Chuck Anderson from Connecticut, he's always talking to us about we need to use this data for things beyond the benefit matrix. And so today we're going to do that. We're going to look at how you can use this data to prioritize clients in terms of weatherization. And we're also going to talk about using the restoration and prevention data to prioritize outreach and education, or Assurance 16. We will take a break in between each of the grantees who speak today for Q&A. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So we're going to start with using energy expenditure data for benefit determination. If you take a look at Wisconsin's data on the next slide, in their snapshot, what you're going to see, and what we saw at the national training as well, is that Wisconsin successfully targets both benefits to higher benefits to higher burden households. In fact, what you see here is that high burden households get on average $183 more than all of LIHEAP households, but they also pay a larger share of the home energy bill. So they're hitting both of these performance measures because of the way that they use data to do business. Now, what I want you all to listen for today is everyone is at a different stage with their system, with their policy, with the way that they, their procedures and how they determine benefits. But there's pieces of each of these discussions that you could be implementing kind of in baby steps. And so as you listen to each of the grantees today, I want you to pick out things that really appeal to you and resonate with you and be thinking about ways that you can incorporate even pieces of what they're doing into your current programs. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jane Blank from Wisconsin.
Hello, everyone. As Melissa said, Wisconsin has been well positioned for several years, but even we have made some changes over the last few recent years. We migrated to a new web system and a new database, and with that process, we even made some additional enhancements to processes. And so I'm going to walk through, at least on this slide, an indication of some of the information that we collect from customers when they apply for energy assistance in Wisconsin. This has not changed in at least probably 15 years or so. We've been collecting this information from all of our customers. So we collect household income, as many of you probably do. Our test period is the 3 previous months. So from, the months prior, the 3 months prior to the month that they're applying. And then behind the scenes, we annualize that income and then save that in our database. We also collect the number of household members. That's, of course, important for various different reasons. One, when you look at cost information, fuel usage, as well as determining the federal poverty level. In Wisconsin, we use actually both. We use the federal poverty guidelines, which is built into our benefit formula. And then we also use state median income, 60% of state median income, to be a little bit more closely comparable to the weatherization program that we worked very succinctly with. We are actually in the same state division as well, not just State Department, but state division. We also collect housing type, and as you'll see on some subsequent slides, housing type has an impact on the fuel costs that customers are consuming, and so whether it's a single-family home versus a mobile home versus an apartment. The count of rooms in the home can have an impact on space heat. So as you're heating, how many rooms are you actually heating? So we do have a count of rooms. We define the number of rooms, so we don't count mud rooms, we don't count laundry rooms. So there are some rooms that we don't count, but for the most part, we count the majority of the rooms in a home. And of course, the main heating fuel, that the type of fuel that you use to heat your home can, of course, have a significant impact on and that's how you determine your energy burden, is what is the first bullet point compared to, the main heating fuel. That's what is used to arrive at a person's energy burden. And then the last bullet point, the heating and electric costs from the prior year, we do collect that and have collected both on both sides for several years. In Wisconsin, we have a ratepayer program, and so by virtue of and by default, because we have that program, we are collecting electric costs as well, which positioned us well, as Melissa mentioned. It positioned us well as it relates to the collection and reporting of the performance measures. I know that there are some states that are still working on obtaining that. They've been successful in collecting annual heating costs, but there's some struggles that some I know states are facing relative to reporting the electric costs when benefits aren't being issued. So, next slide. So what do we do to determine benefit amounts? Well, it's quite complex, but we tried to kind of narrow it down as best we could. One of the main points is we have what we call a proxy table, or we have proxy values behind the scenes programmed into our system that are used, and I'll get to that on a subsequent slide, but that are used to kind of do a reality check and adjust, in some cases, adjust folks' energy costs that they're reporting to quote unquote normalize it. So, and how do we arrive at those values? So we basically take the annual heating expenditures from a prior year. So we actually use applicant data. So the annual heating expenditures are then compared to the proxy averages, and then it's, as I mentioned, it's kind of normalized. So a final benefit amount for each of these households is then determined, based on all of the values that essentially that I just represented on the previous slide. Go ahead, next slide, Michelle. So these proxy tables that I mentioned, these average heating expenditures, how do we determine that? So each year in the summer, we do a whole bunch of analysis, and we take all of the annual, it's actually cost. So we do collect consumption information, but we actually use the cost information to conduct this analysis. And so we take all of the recipients, all of the customers who received benefits from the prior year, and then we do some simulations. And so basically we determine what their fuel prices will be. We use the heating degree days to adjust that accordingly, and we also obtain information from the Energy Information Administration, EIA. Some of you out there might be using projected fuel cost information from EIA. And so basically we take last year's caseload, we make some assumptions, we make some adjustments, and then the outputs of that, and I'm kind of simplifying this, but basically the outputs of that are what determine these proxy values, and those are programmed into our system. And the next slide. What do the proxy tables do? So what is the impact? What do we use this information for? So essentially, if someone is consuming a significant amount of energy, maybe their home needs to be weatherized, and it's very, very high, or maybe it's very, very low, we will make adjustments accordingly. So, and the range is 75 to 200%. So as the second bullet point kind of represents, if someone comes in and they report their energy costs, we compare that, and this is all kind of magical and on the fly in the system. So you don't have an intake worker with a table spreadsheet or something looking this up. This is built into our system. But the customer's annual costs are compared to these tables, and if it's below the 75%, so in other words, if they're consuming, you have some households that just keep their thermostat very low because of the cost impact, we will adjust it up to 75% of that value when we compute the benefit amount. Likewise, or conversely, if someone is consuming or has really high expenditures, what we will do is we will compare that to 200% of the proxy value and adjust it downward essentially and take twice or to 200% of that proxy value when we compute benefits. The last scenario is basically if someone is unable to provide energy costs, we do, if someone has an energy burden but they're making a separate payment to their landlord, or maybe their heat's included in the rent and you're just basically unable to obtain what their actual costs are because it's wrapped into their rent payment, we will use the 75% of the proxy value when we compute their benefit. So that's really how the guts of this proxy values behind the scenes kind of work. And you can go on next slide. Thank you. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples to maybe show a visual aids for me. I don't know, I'm a visual learner, so they always work for me, to walk through kind of how this works. And so you're going to see 4 different customers that come in. All of these customers, each of them live in a single family home with 4 rooms. Each of the households has 2 household members. Of course, those are all important elements when determining our benefit formula and the benefit outcome. The main heating fuel for all of these customers is natural gas, and all of the households have reported an annual income of $12,000. So basically on all of those fronts, we're all on even playing fields. So we're all within the same range of everything. So what happens when they've reported their energy costs and what kind of impact does it have to the proxy table? So first customer, they've reported $700 as their heating costs. which is roughly 6%, is what their energy burden is computed to. And just kind of fast forwarding and jumping down to the bottom, their benefit is computed to be $412, and we were able to use actual costs because it fell within that 75 to 200% range. The next household, they've reported 450. Seems maybe kind of low, but it still falls within that range. So the proxy heating cost for this group is $581. That is the natural gas home, single family home with 4 rooms, I think it was. And so the proxy value for that group is $581. The range then, 75% of 581 is 436. 2 times that is 1,162. So the 450 falls within that range. So we're going to use that actual cost when we compute the benefit. Household number 2 benefit is $264. Okay, that's okay, Michelle. Go ahead and go to 3. So 3, this household is reported $1,000. Boy, that seems an awful lot higher than the 450. However, as you can see, it still falls within that range. Their energy burden is 2% more than that first household, 4% more than that second household, but they still fall within that range. We've used their actual cost when we computed their benefit, and their benefit amount is $588. Fourth household. Maybe they've got heat included in the rent, so there's no way to obtain what their actual costs are. This is that representation that I mentioned on the previous slide, where we then use 75% of that proxy value. So we've now used $436 to represent that that's what their actual costs are when we've computed their benefit. So their benefit is $256. So it is a lesser amount, but it's unable to determine what it is. And so we've used these values for several years now to have a more realistic computation of customers' energy burden when we are unable to obtain actual cost information. So the percent of the heating bill paid, it's magically 59% for the 3 households. Can't compute the percent of the bill paid basically for household 4 because we don't really have that, so we don't compute that and store that. And all of the customers have the same percentage then of their bill that's been paid. So even though household number 3 received a benefit of $588 compared to the household number 2 that received $264, that's quite a difference, in someone's pocketbook. However, it's really all relative then to the heating costs that are being reported. So this is from the state snapshot, and so this is using fiscal year 2016 data. We just reported the 17 data, so I know the simulations aren't quite ready yet. So this is, a year ago, roughly. And you can see, so the first 2 bars essentially that are circled there is just a representation of all of the households. And then as you can see, as it's represented by each fuel type, we are paying, as Holly mentioned in the beginning, we are paying a higher bill essentially to those high burden households. So for all households, $590 compared to the rest of the eligible households but don't fall into that high energy burden category, the benefit is $407. So you can see that each one of these by fuel type, there's a difference in the size of the bar essentially. And so all of the blue bars tend to be a little bit higher than the orange bars. And then the representation basically of the percent of the bill. And so as you can see, all households, roughly 26% for the high energy burden and 23% of all households, eligible households that are not in that high energy burden category. Similarly, not quite as much of a difference here when you compare the benefits to each other, but the percent of the bill still on the high burden household, so those blue bars are just a little bit higher. So we use actual customer information that's provided to us when we compute all benefits. And we do, as you can see in the outputs, we do pay a higher benefit and a higher percentage of the bill to those high burden households. we did have to make some system programming, and the utility partners did help us support some of the development and worked in close partnership with us. We actually have some of this automated with our utilities. So when a customer walks in to apply for energy assistance, they provide the intake worker with their name, their address, and their account number, and then our system basically, it's like a web service, and it goes to the utilities' actual system, their site, and database, and grabs the account information, ensures that it matches up. So if Fred Flintstone's listing Barney Rubble's information, it's going to come up and and show the worker, oh, something's not right. It's also going to show whether the account is active or closed. But the main point is it shows kilowatt hours or therms, but then it shows the worker what the actual costs are. They click a button, and then it's automatically adopted into the application. So very, very powerful, very helpful. It improves the data integrity, and then it most certainly improves the efficiency of the intake process itself. And what a wonderful customer service for those particular customers. So this didn't happen overnight for us. It took us quite a few years to get where we are today. And you don't necessarily have to assume that this is the way to do everything. Everyone has a different business model. Everyone has different resources and course structures. But it's just important to know that using customer information and customer data can prove to be very helpful when you're establishing what your benefit matrix is. And Melissa, I think I'm handing it over to you.
Yes, and so I want to underscore Jane's last point. It took several years to get where Jane is, but there are pieces of what she talked about that all of you can begin thinking about immediately. So as we saw in DC, just using the data to kind of true up your existing matrix is a first kind of baby step, but you may also have a system that would allow you to get use the information you're getting from utilities about last year's client bills and use that actual number to compute their energy benefit for this year. I mean, there are a million ways you can use the data you're getting to better reflect what people are actually paying for their energy. And so if that's a factor in your benefit matrix and you want some help figuring out the best way and maybe some different steps you can take to using that data, you can reach out to a prize or even to Jane and talk to her a little bit about ways you can do that. But we are going to take questions right now. Michelle, do you mind walking folks through the way they can do that?
Sure. So hi, everyone. Just as a reminder, if you want to ask a question, feel free to type in a question in the question box anytime throughout the webinar. And then during these question breaks, I will read out the question to the group so you can get it answered. Or also feel free to raise your hand. And then during the question breaks, I will unmute you and you'll be able to ask your question to the group. So right now we have one question, and the question is asking if there will be a PDF version of the slides available. And the answer is yes. Once the recording of the webinar is posted to the Performance Management website, there will also be a PDF that you can download with the slides. But also feel free to email us at a prize if you would like a copy earlier than that. And other than that, right now it doesn't seem like there's any questions, so we'll move on to make sure that the rest of the speakers have time for their piece, but there may be more questions at the end.
Okay, great. And for those of you who have questions, you can go in and type them in too, and we'll just pick them up at the break. So the second strategy we're going to look at is using data to prioritize clients and look at client bill savings. And if you want to go to the next slide, we're going to talk to the folks from Iowa. Now, many states are targeting clients for weatherization based on expected energy bill savings or using energy burden data. So we've listed, Minnesota and Wisconsin, and Iowa, but Iowa's been doing it for a really long time, and they've got it down to an art. And so we're going to hear from Christine and Greg, and once again, be listening for the fact that you are now collecting this data as part of the performance measure requirements. What are some of the ways that you can begin incorporating this data into your own state processes as you target folks and prioritize folks for services? So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Christine.
Hey, hello everybody. I'm just going to give a brief overview of our structure and our process, and then Greg Dahlhoff will get into the details for us. In Iowa, we are lucky enough to be in the same division as the Weatherization program. So you can go to the next slide, please. We have 17 sub-grantees that administer the LIHEAP program and 18 that administer the Weatherization program. So it's the same LIHEAP agencies, and we're just adding one local government. Each year, we have about 80,000 applicants. Actually, this year, we're looking at about 84,000. And when applicants apply for LIHEAP, they are applying for Weatherization at the same time. So the LIHEAP client list does become Weatherization's waiting list. So Weatherization does not have to go out and search for clients. They've already have eligible people available. So all LIHEAP clients are considered possibilities for Weatherization, regardless of their fuel usage. Okay, so quick overview about the process. The LIHEAP client list is sent to Greg Dahlhoff, who is a contractor for the state of Iowa. He obtains energy usage from the investor-owned utilities. That fuel usage is then sent to the state weatherization office, who imports it into their reporting system, and then sends that data out to each sub-grantee. The sub-grantees then import that data, and they have to do it this way because it's not a web-based application, it's an access database. But so far it's working well. Hopefully in the future we'll have something web-based. After they import the data, the sub-grantee creates a priority list from that database. There's always a list of individual households that don't have any fuel data. So the agencies, when they run the list, they determine who the vendor is, and they reach out to the vendor to obtain the fuel usage. Once they have that, they plug it back into the database, and then they update their priority list. So that helps ensure that we don't miss the people who have a municipality or an REC or have a propane vendor. We don't want them to lose out on great benefits just because they may not be with an investor-owned utility. So now I'll pass this along to Greg, who will get into the weeds.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to go into some of the nuts and bolts of what's done in the Iowa Weatherization program to prioritize the clients. And a similar framework can be used by any state weatherization program by using the data that's being collected with the LIHEAP performance measures. But we'll start with a little background. Iowa Weatherization program began prioritizing clients back in the mid-1990s. And they used a simple mechanism of just annual heating BTUs. And then in the late 90s, they began using estimated energy savings. We had good numbers for estimating the energy savings because we had data from their annual evaluation process. Then around 2006, they added the estimated electricity impacts as well. And the prioritization began using estimated bill savings at that point, so you could total both the heating fuel and electricity impacts. And that's basically what they've been doing since then. We'll first do an overview of what Iowa's doing, discuss how LIHEAP performance data can be used along with the National Weatherization Evaluation to implement a similar approach elsewhere. So the Iowa Weatherization Systems Program starts with energy usage data that's already being collected as part of the evaluation, estimates savings and bill savings, and from there the estimates are used along with different factors for various housing types. For example, houses tend to have a higher percentage of savings than mobile homes, so we account for those differences. And differences in fuel prices are factored in so that prospective WAP clients that heat with higher cost fuels tend to be more highly prioritized. Next, high energy expenditures are only one measure of vulnerability, though. Households with vulnerable members such as elderly, young children, or disabled members are also important considerations, and they're handled in this process by using a 5% adder for households with members in each of those three categories. So any individual household could have as much as a 15% bump in the prioritization based upon the members of the household. And as Christine mentioned, the sub-grantees have tools to calculate the priority where that usage hasn't been collected. The major investor-owned utilities serve a huge swathe of the Iowa population. But again, there are those that use bulk delivered fuels as well, and the REMC. So they're also walk-ins, and the usage is entered at the agencies through their reporting system, and it calculates the prioritization value and then rolls it in with the rest of the list. And each sub-grantee then has its own list and ordered from the highest to the lowest, and they just work down from the top of that list. Next, yeah. Does it work? Well, annual evaluations have shown, recent ones show that the program's been getting about 25% savings for gas. It was saving around 21% in the late 1990s. Even when the basic BTU prioritization was used. And if you compare that with other state results from the national evaluation in the same climate region, you're typically seeing between 13 and 18% savings by housing type. So what we have here, this chart provides a plot of usage prior to weatherization. That's the baseline usage on the bottom. And savings on the left axis, the points in the black line are indicators of the savings. The percentage savings is the green curved line toward the top. And so you can see as you move into higher baseline consumption, you get higher savings, and the percentage savings increases as well. And so that's kind of the rationale behind prioritizing on usage. And what they're seeing in Iowa now, again, as I mentioned, 25% savings versus 13 to 18% based on housing type nationally for the cold climate region. Next, please. And the baseline usage of the WAP program in 2016, for example, was 30% higher than the light population overall. So if they weren't using a prioritization at all, you would expect to see around 19% savings for the program. Again, jumping back to the previous chart, if you go down the curve, you would expect to see about 19% savings if you didn't do the prioritization. And I do want to make mention here that the Iowa Weatherization Program is comprehensive, well monitored. So of course not all of the high performance can be attributed to prioritization, but it certainly represents a good segment of that part of savings that is better than the national average. Next, please. The LIHEAP Performance Measures Data, in tandem with results from the National Weatherization Evaluation, can be used by any state to do a similar thing. And you can use specific factors from the National Weatherization Evaluation to account for housing type as well as by climate. Next, please. It's a multi-step process, but it's not overly complex. In the cases of gas, propane, and fuel oil heated homes, you would calculate two parts, the heating part and the electricity part, where you would have an estimated percentage savings. We'll get to that on the next slide. Estimated percentage savings times the annual heating fuel expenditure, which is information you get from the LIHEAP Performance Measures Data. Electricity part would be the same thing, an estimated percentage savings times the annual electricity expenditure. You'd add those two up, gives you kind of a real rough estimate of what the bill savings might be. And then you would apply an adjustment for vulnerable households, similar at any level that you would want, but in Iowa they use 5% adders for each of the major groups. For electrically heated homes, it's much simpler. You just use the estimated percentage savings times the average electricity expenditure. It gives you an estimated electricity savings, bill savings, and you apply your adjustment again on that. Next slide, please. Now, where do you get your percentage savings numbers from? If you don't have an evaluation done recently for your program, you can use ballpark results that come from the National Weatherization Evaluation. And what I've got here are kind of simplified groupings. There are more detailed numbers, but you're going to find, if you prioritize on expenditures, that there is a top tier. I mean, in Iowa, the weatherization program weatherizes between 1% and 2% of the number of LIHEAP applicants for any given year. So it's a really small percentage. And there is a top level in the LIHEAP group of very high energy expenditures. And so I would expect to see a similar trend nationally. So it's not too far out of the ballpark to use these general numbers. 17% savings would be used for single family and small multifamilies in cold, moderate, and hot, humid climates. Cold would also include the very cold. 13% for mobile homes in cold climates, 7% for mobile homes in hot and moderate climates. And for the electricity part, about 7% electricity savings in all regions for homes that heat with you do not heat with electricity. For electrically heated homes, about 7% in all homes, all in cold climates. 15% for single family and small multifamily homes in moderate and hot, and 7% for mobile homes in hot climates, moderate and hot climates. These are rough adjustments, but they get you in the ballpark for prioritization. And I guess to summarize, that we know client prioritization and estimated bill savings has been an effective tool to increase the savings in the WAP program, and it still accounts for various aspects of vulnerability in the population. The LIHEAP Performance Measures Data, along with the results of the National Weatherization Evaluation, really provides all the necessary information to implement a similar approach in any state weatherization program. It gets you in the ballpark of where your WAP program will save the most. And that's what I have. Thank you.
If I could interject real quickly, I just want to thank Greg. He is an amazing contractor for us, let alone an amazing person, but he has done such a good job with this, and he evaluates our program every year and has for a number of years. He is well respected. He helps us determine any changes we may need to make in our program to better target high energy users. And I just highly recommend, if you have any questions, please reach out to him.
Thanks, Christine.
You're welcome.
Does anyone have questions for Greg or Christine?
We do have one question, Melissa, asking if they want to learn more about this process, who they should get in contact with.
So we have contact information at the end of these slides for Greg and Christine. And then you can also, of course, as we keep mentioning, you're welcome to contact Apprise and we can help you think about ways to implement or use your data in a similar way to what Iowa is doing.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melissa. And we do have another question. You mentioned that Iowa has demonstrated high percentage savings, even going back as far as 20 years. How can you attribute the high savings in the Iowa program to prioritizing clients?
Well, in 2016, the average baseline gas usage for the WAP clients was 30% higher than the overall WAP population. So we know that targeting is working. We also know that that high savings follows high usage. So that whole package is working. The program's evolved in a number of ways over the past 20 years, and it's impossible to say exactly how much is due to the client prioritization, but we know that it follows from the savings, high savings follows prioritizing on high usage. So we would expect to see something several percentage points lower if the program was not targeting high usage. And when they had good numbers as far back as the late 90s, where electricity was not part of the prioritization, thinking back that far, there were very little electricity measures going into homes at that time as well. And so just doing it on BTU was a pretty useful tool way back then. But the program evolved significantly, and this has been an effective tool.
Great. And there are no more questions now, Melissa.
Great. We'll move right into our third grantee. We're going to talk about prioritizing outreach and education. If you want to go to the next slide. What you'll notice here is New Hampshire's state profile. These are available on the performance management website. And something that should stick out to you is that they use about $393,000 or less than 1% of their funds for crisis assistance. And if you look at their other category, they use nearly $1 million or $1 million for Assurance 16 activities. And so what we're going to hear about today is how data is used to target Assurance 16 services and essentially reduce the need for crisis assistance. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tracy.
Thank you, Melissa. So basically, the background for New Hampshire's approach to crisis is that we do not operate a separate crisis component for fuel assistance to address the emergency situations. Instead, a household with a crisis situation, whether they have low fuel, no fuel, have been disconnected with their heating utilities, we will have their application expedited and a benefit will be awarded to relieve that emergency. Their entire benefit is awarded at that time. So even if their benefit is $825, but their emergency would be resolved in $300 with an oil delivery, minimum delivery, we would award the whole $825. The vendor would deliver enough to get them out of the crisis, and that amount to take them out of the crisis is what we record as the emergency or the crisis dollar amount. The rest of the benefit is used throughout the season. We know by using the restoration and prevention data as we're tracking them that about 17% of our applicants statewide apply when they're in a crisis situation, primarily deliverable fuel clients in the Northeast. So they're usually either out of fuel or nearly out, so we consider that a quarter of a tank of fuel or less. Our issue is how to prevent these clients from entering the crisis situation, especially those who apply each year in that crisis situation. Next slide, please. So we will use the Assurance 16 funds to provide self-sufficiency education and information to all households with those fast-tracked crisis applications within the program year. The activities that the subgrantees use to apply, for applicants to apply in a timely manner in order to avoid these life-threatening situations and special delivery charges, which we know deplete their benefit. They educate them on managing resources, applying prior to a crisis situation. We give them the time frames in which to apply for the following year. Referrals to other resources, always on communicating with their vendors, and one-on-one budget counseling if they will participate. It's time-consuming, but it is something that we're very passionate about, especially with the Assurance 16 program. Next slide, please. Our expected impacts of the Assurance 16 activities are that to encourage the household that experience the crisis to apply for assistance prior to a crisis situation developing. We want to change their behavior so that they don't experience those crisis situations, because we know that when they're in crisis, it puts the agency that's seeing them in crisis, the vendor is then working double time to get those deliveries out, and in addition to all of their regular scheduled deliveries. And then we would also hopefully reduce the need for LIHEAP by promoting self-sufficiency, because we're not only giving them LIHEAP, we're also giving them access to other resources, making sure they're on the electric assistance program, which is a ratepayer discount program, other programs that are within the community action agencies in New Hampshire, and then outside resources as well. Next slide, please. So when a household who is in crisis comes into an agency, at the time they apply, their application is expedited, and we document them on the application as an emergency in our software system. That's when they're given that basic information about applying for next year. Each agency has different ideas of what they do, and some will give magnets with, this is the time to apply, put it on your refrigerator, you can come back. Some will give handouts. Whatever works for each agency is what they're doing right now. At the end of the program year, we generate an emergency assignments report from our software, and that report corresponds to the restoration and prevention data used for the performance measures. Pertinent data from that report is exported to a spreadsheet for tracking purposes, and the spreadsheet is that working document for tracking households as they apply for assistance in the new program year. So where we're just finishing program year 18, anybody who was an emergency and applied as a crisis this past season is now going to be the Assurance 16 caseload for program year 19, and that will be worked all year. Next slide, please. We do track the household separately by deliverable fuel, utilities, and those with heat included in the rent. And then the subgrantees, right in July, when we start taking applications for vulnerable populations, they will start mailing out applications, sending out email blasts, doing telephone interviews for those who have transportation issues or that may be homebound. And also some of them will provide incentives to return those applications by entering their name into a raffle for a grocery store gift card to encourage that early application. Subgrantees are then required to report on outcomes 3 times a year, and they're required to submit their working spreadsheet at the beginning of the program year and also at the end, so that we have oversight to make sure that they are doing those activities that they're telling us that they do. They also submit an Assurance 16 plan in addition to their regular plan, regular LIHEAP plan that they submit to us. And we do, as a matter of fact, I had a meeting this morning that we share those results with the subgrantees throughout the year. Next slide, please. So households that applied while experiencing energy emergency in program 16 are the program year 17 caseload. We found that out of the 1,237 cases that were targeted for Assurance 16 in program year 17, out of those 36% did not apply. So we can't tell whether they achieved greater self-sufficiency or not, but 32% applied and received the same level or an increase in benefit, and another 32% received greater self-sufficiency. So they were tracked and they received either a lower benefit, which means they had higher income, or they were denied for being over income. The crisis outcomes for those that applied, 81% had a reduced dependency. They applied, but they were not an emergency. And then 19% of the households applied once again during a crisis situation. We consider them repeat emergency applicants. Next slide, please. So we did this again in comparison for program year 17, which is the program year 18 caseload that we're working right now. We have 33% that did not apply for LIHEAP assistance in this year at all. 51% applied and received the same level of benefit or an increase, and 16% achieved greater self-sufficiency, which is that lower benefit or they were denied for being over income. And so in this year, we saw that 84% had a reduced dependency because they applied but were not an emergency, and that 16% once applied during a crisis situation, which is a little bit greater than the previous year. So comparing the results from year to year, we see that there was an increase of 3 percentage points for those that applied, but they were not an emergency. And then there was a decrease in 3 percentage points for those that applied, but they as a repeat emergency, which is really what we're targeting. We do not want people to continuously be an emergency year after year. So that decrease helps us to see that the program is working, but there probably are some activities that we could do to make it a better outcome. Next slide, please. We know that crisis situations are difficult, they're dangerous and expensive to address. To reduce and prevent crisis situations, we utilize the Assurance 16 funds to furnish education, counseling, resources to clients that applied in a crisis situation the previous year. And overall, we found that this strategy has produced success at reducing the number of clients who apply in crisis situations multiple times. We are implementing some enhancements to our software this year to identify the number of households who are new applicants or returning applicants. That's something that we were not identifying. And we had one agency that told me this morning that they were identifying that, and more than 50% of her emergency caseload were new applicants. So that was helpful. With that, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Tracy.
We do have one typed in question that's, how do we know if the Assurance 16 program is working well or if there are areas that could be improved?
Well, I think one of them would be the point that we see a decrease in repeat applicants. That is one indicator. And by reaching out to households and encouraging a proactive approach in applying for services, we're reducing that percentage of emergencies in general, one household at a time. We are always looking for improvements through our data system to especially see how these households do over a longer period, so we continue to track them year after year.
Great, thanks. And we do have one question going back to Wisconsin in the beginning of the presentation, which says, by paying benefits based on actual costs, isn't Wisconsin encouraging waste and penalizing more frugal use of energy?
No, actually, Wisconsin determines the benefits based on several factors, one of which, and one of the primary factors, of course, is energy costs. Unfortunately, households who are in low-income situations have perhaps less control of their poor housing, and weatherization hasn't, been able to improve, that housing situation. And so those proxy values are intended to normalize and adjust those costs accordingly. So we think it balances out our goals of trying to address energy burden differences without, penalizing the households that use, less energy, to keep their bills down. So, no, we actually think that it works well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jane. And it doesn't look like we have any other questions, Melissa.
Okay. So this is a lot of information. As Michelle said, we'll have the PDF available along with the recording, and people can request it sooner as well. We also have a lot of resources out there for folks that want to learn a little bit more. We always mention the virtual library. So some of you heard Tracy talking about Assurance 16. But you may be relatively new and not super familiar with it. All of that information is on the virtual library, and same with weatherization, and even a lot of information about the benefit matrix. So take a look at that virtual library, especially if you're new and need some ways to walk through the program. We have the state snapshots and executive summaries up on the performance management website. Many of you who are at the national training have seen this. For those of you who have not, I'd encourage you to go to the website, and if you need help logging in, there's information on the website to get your login information for those sections that are login only. Many of you who were in Washington, D.C. asked for the presentations and the exercises and the answer keys with the solutions. Those have also been posted to the website, and so you're welcome to go take a look at those. And if for some reason you can't find them, let us know. For those of you who weren't at the national training, encourage you to walk through those exercises, and if you need assistance, you can call us at a prize. We do have another webinar upcoming, June 14th, where we'll be talking a little bit more about using LIHEAP performance management data. You know, we spent 4 to 5 years, literally 4 to 5 years, talking about collecting data and reporting data, and now we're going to spend time giving you lots of examples of ways that you can use data, and so June 14th will be no exception. We also have new resources. Many of you, we walked through the data case study where we looked at people applying for or receiving LIHEAP and whether those numbers are going down and going down for certain groups. That was the first case study that was made available. And I believe it is posted or will be posted shortly. And then the work group is also working on data integrity studies. So many of them are looking at, you know, if you, in cases where you have limited data or in cases where you have more data for some fuel types than others, or, you know, wherever there are kind of wonky data things happening, how reliable is your data and what can you still take away from that? And those are the kinds of things that they're looking at. On the next slide, you'll see all of our contact information. So all of the presenters, including my email as well. If you need assistance kind of saying, gosh, I really liked what Tracy was doing, or, you know, what Jane's doing is awesome, but my system doesn't allow me to do that. So what's an intermediate step I can take until I can get there? A prize is available to kind of brainstorm with you about the best way to take your data and use it in a way that's meaningful within the context of your existing program. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And with that, we'll take any last questions.
No, it doesn't look like there's any final questions, Melissa.
All right, well, feel free to reach out as you think about this a little more if you do have questions. Otherwise, have a great day and a great holiday weekend. Thanks for joining us.